Amazingly, quite a lot of people actually think that because cacti and many other succulent plants grow in desert areas, in barren desert and semi-desert areas, that because of this they do not actually need any or a lot of nutrients, a lot of fertilizers, and that it is okay just to occasionally water them. Well, guess what? That's far from the truth. And so in this video, I'd like to give you a little bit more background, a little bit more information about this whole topic of cacti, nutrients, fertilizing. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, welcome back to my greenhouse. My name is Joe. In today's video, we'll be talking about nutrients for cacti and other succulent plants, so about fertilizing. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about how I actually go about fertilizing my cacti, which type of fertilizer, when I do that, how often, and also a little bit about the backgrounds. So I thought I'd give you a little bit more information that will hopefully help you appreciate a little bit more about when, how, and what to actually feed your cacti with. So when we're thinking about which type of fertilizers are actually best suited for our cacti, let's step back for a moment and think a little bit about the specific environment that our cacti and many other succulents are actually growing in their natural habitats. They of course grow in deserts, in semi-deserts, savannas, in areas that are generally called arid areas. And what's typical for an arid area is that generally the evaporation is actually higher than the precipitation. So the amount of water that is actually evaporating out of the groundwater deep down below the surface of the desert, evaporating up throughout the period of a year, is actually larger than the amount of water generally coming down through precipitation, through rain. So that's really what defines an area that is termed an arid area. So the evaporation actually exceeds the precipitation. Now that's quite different to, a lot of humid and temperate areas and climates that we may be used to, where a lot of our plants are growing in our gardens, and also a lot of the plants that we have as house plants. So they will often be coming from areas where the actual precipitation far exceeds the evaporation. So hence those are all plants that are not from arid areas. Now why is this important? It's because in areas like humid, tropical, temperate areas, we often have a lot of organic material that actually can then fall off trees, leaves, all kinds of organic material that will actually then be transformed by bacteria and by processes, by biochemical processes. They'll be transformed into fertilizing components, into fertilizer components. And so those organic fertilizers are the typical fertilizers, the typical organic nutrients that we get in those parts of the world. So that's really quite different now in many areas that our favorite plants are actually growing in, those arid areas. Here we actually have far less organic material. We have far less decay of organic material that is coming from leaves and other organisms, because there aren't that many around. So where then do the nutrients for our cacti in these areas come from? Well, unlike the organic nutrients, here in the desert environments, semi-desert environments that cacti grow in, we actually have a lot of those percolating fluids, the evaporating fluids from the subsurface. They will be dissolving as they rise through the rock. They'll be dissolving minerals, mineral substances, elements, and they'll be taking those along towards the surface of the soil, of the ground. And so what we find is a quite enriched couple of centimeters of topsoil, if you like, in many desert and arid areas, where there's quite an abundancy of many minerals. And it's these minerals that cacti actually have specialized in actually picking up to use as nutrients. And something that I find particularly fascinating is the fact that nitrogen, which is a key component of organic fertilizers and organic nutrients, so nitrogen that is formed from the decay of organic material in humid areas. In deserts, a lot of the nitrogen that will actually be available for plants to use will not be coming from organic decay, because there isn't that much of it. It will actually be coming from the rare but very intense thunder and lightning storms that we get in desert environments. And so nitrogen, which is also a key component of the atmosphere of air, will actually be transformed in these lightning storms and will be washed with the rain down into the soil, available for plants in these areas to actually use. Now, why am I telling you all this? It's really to make the point that a lot of our cacti will, because they live in these arid environments, they will need mineral type of fertilizers rather than organic type of fertilizers. At least that's what they really prefer. Of course, you can feed them organic fertilizers as well, but they really don't come that close to the real thing. So I've just mentioned one key component of a fertilizer, and that is nitrogen. As I said, there are actually three main components to a good fertilizer for cacti, and that actually goes for other fertilizers for other plants as well. The three key components are always abbreviated, and that's an international sort of convention, because that's related to the chemical symbols. So the three elements are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the three major components, the major elements, if you like, that are the components of a good fertilizer. Component number one, nitrogen, is actually responsible for tissue growth, for growth of stems, leaves especially. So it's really to help plants basically grow and flourish with their stems and leaves. So typically cacti do need nitrogen, even though it's not the typical organic type of nitrogen that they feed on. But in comparison to a lot of the plants that we know from non-arid areas, so from temperate, tropical, humid areas, those plants from those areas will actually need a lot more nitrogen than cacti do. So let's keep that in mind. A relatively low requirement, a low amount of nitrogen needed by cacti. The second major element is phosphorus. And among other things, phosphorus is actually required by the plants to strengthen root systems and to help the development of flowers and seeds. So phosphorus is a very key component if we're wanting to stimulate our cacti and other succulents to actually flower, to show their blooms. In fact, next to providing them with a dormancy period, also providing them with a fertilizer that is relatively rich in phosphorus. That's a second prerequisite for encouraging cacti to actually flower. And the third major element of a fertilizer is potassium. Potassium is really important for the health of our plants. Potassium actually strengthens the tissues, it strengthens those stems and leaves that have been encouraged to grow through the nitrogen. And so potassium really, really important to help a plant stay strong and healthy. In addition to those three main elements, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, we also have a whole series of so-called minor elements or trace elements that are really important for the health of cacti. So these trace elements or secondary elements will be required in significantly smaller amounts, but nevertheless they're also very, very important for the health and the well-being of our plants. And they will typically include iron, copper, zinc, molybdenum, boron, magnesium, and a couple more others, which I can't all remember. But these are all trace elements, and they are actually the typical trace elements and minerals that, as I said earlier, would be coming along with those percolating fluids as mineral-rich fluids from out of the subsurface towards the top couple of centimeters of ground and soil, if you like, substrate that our cacti grow in their natural habitats. And remember, a lot of cacti have these very shallow, very wide cactus root network systems, and they are just maybe a centimeter or two below the top of the soil, the top of the substrate, and that of course helps them just gobble up any evaporation, any fog, any moisture that they can pick up in these desert environments. But at the same time, it also helps them to filter out those mineral rich components that they need and that they will feed on as nutrients. The majority of good quality cactus fertilizers on the market these days actually also have these trace elements added, and they actually have them in a soluble sulfated form, which prevents these trace minerals from simply precipitating out of the solution and getting lost. Some of the better cactus fertilizers on the market these days actually also include chemical buffers which help to manage the soil pH. So, in summary, the main elements, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and the trace elements that I mentioned, those are all key ingredients of a good cactus fertilizer. So if you can, use a mineral type fertilizer for your cacti rather than an organic rich or an organic type of fertilizer. And a very key difference is that the ratio of those, especially three main elements, will be quite different between the two types of fertilizers. Cacti really want a very low N, a very high P, and a sort of intermediate level potassium type of fertilizer. Typical organic fertilizers will, in contrast, have a very high nitrogen level or amount and slightly lower phosphorus and potassium. So the three main elements are always abbreviated with N, P, and K, and that's an international convention because that also follows the chemical element symbols. And the nice thing is that fertilizers on sale will always show the ratio of these three main elements, the N, P, K, and that's where it's really important to understand that there is a real difference in ratios. So the next time you're in a plant nursery or a plant store and you're looking at the fertilizers there, take a look at the different fertilizers and take a look at the NPK ratios or proportions that they have, and you'll notice very quickly, fertilizers that are there to boost primarily the leaf growth and the stem growth, so all the greenery that plants want to actually develop, they will be high in N, so that nitrogen level, and slightly lower in the P and the K. Those fertilizers, on the other hand, that want to encourage flowering, they will be relatively lower in the N, the nitrogen, and higher in the P, the phosphorus, and the potassium. And like I said, there's that difference between organic versus mineral type of fertilizers. Our cacti really want two things. They want a mineral type of fertilizer, and they want a fertilizer that is relatively low in N, certainly a lower proportion of N than there is P and K. And so typically, a cactus fertilizer, when you look at the back of the box or the bottle that you buy it in, it will be, for example, a ratio of 5, 10, 5. So 5 nitrogen, 10 on the phosphorus, and 5 on the potassium. Now, it doesn't really matter exactly whether it's 4, 5, 6, it's not the exact number that's important, it's the ratio, the proportion that's important. And so in order for you to use a fertilizer that is suitable for cacti, always look out for a fertilizer that is lower in the N than it is in the P and the K. Now what's excellent is that there are actually quite a lot of cactus fertilizers, so fertilizers that have already been designed with all this in mind, with providing those correct proportions and ratios of N, P, and K, and also providing those those trace elements. There's quite a few of these cactus fertilizers on the market, and I don't have a favorite brand. You can actually vary them as well a little bit. What is important for you to know is that there are, of course, they come in fluid form, they come in powder or granular form, and they also come in a sort of a granular form that can be added into your cactus substrate or soil. I personally prefer using the either liquid form or the actual powder form. So cactus fertilizers are perhaps a little bit more expensive than their organic counterparts, but I would argue that you're not going to be fertilizing your cacti that often, and I'll come to that in a moment, how often. But because you're not going to be using that fertilizer as often as you would be using a organic fertilizer for your other household plants, I would argue that both from a cost perspective, but especially from a benefit perspective, you really should be thinking about using only special cactus fertilizers to actually feed your plants. So some of you will probably ask, so what happens if I feed my cactus a organic type of fertilizer or a fertilizer that is quite high in nitrogen, well, it might grow initially faster and bigger than its counterparts that are, being given a normal cactus fertilizer. So it'll grow faster, but it will very quickly also probably start to bloat. It will get an unnatural shape and form, and what's worse is it will actually very quickly become or get a quite unhealthy tissue, epidermis, so the outer layer, the outer skin, if you like. So those cacti will actually become quite unhealthy much faster than their counterparts being given, the appropriate type of fertilizer. Okay, my apologies if I've bombarded you with a lot of abbreviations and some, basic chemistry, fertilizer chemistry here in this video so far. I hope it doesn't confuse you. I hope it actually, in fact, helps you understand a little bit more about the components and the function of those components in a good quality cactus fertilizer. By the way, pretty much everything I've said so far is for typical desert growing cacti. When we think about the types of cacti, so epicacti that we have, like the Thanksgiving cactus, the Christmas cactus, Easter cactus, these types of epicacti, they of course, they grow less in arid environments, but they are actually in sort of semi-tropical environments where a lot of times we will actually be perfectly fine to feed those with organic fertilizers. So they're a lot more like our typical other household plants, if you like. So remember, a lot of what I've said before applicable to the majority of cacti, so semi-desert, desert growing, but when it comes to cacti and also other succulents from the more humid, semi-tropical, rainforesty type of environments, they're, perfectly okay to use organic fertilizers. And a lot of other succulent plants, so beyond the family of the Cactaceae, the cacti, a lot of those other plants, other succulent plants like euphorbias, for example, I personally actually fertilize them, I feed them with the very same fertilizer that I use for my cacti. And, there are, of course, also some special available fertilizers just for the other succulents. And I occasionally use those fertilizers as well. They might have just a tiny bit more of the N of the nitrogen component than the typical cactus fertilizer. So, up to you really what you prefer. As I say, I actually use the cactus fertilizer pretty much for most of my succulent plants, with exception of the leafy plants from sort of rainforest areas, epicacti. Now, when do I actually fertilize my plants and how often? First of all, the when. Absolutely important. I never fertilize, I never actually give any nutrients to my cacti throughout the dormancy period. So during the winter months, when the plants are standing relatively cool and they're hardly or not getting watered at all anyway, because their metabolism, the photosynthesis is, pretty much drawn all the way back to zero or near zero, they would also, even if you fed them, not be able to actually use those nutrients. So I never use nutrients, I never fertilize my plants during the dormancy period, during the winter months. As we come out of that dormancy period, though, and in my case, living on the northern hemisphere, that will be typically around about March, maybe early April, when the temperatures and the light levels start to rise outside. That's also when I will slowly be transitioning my plants out of the dormancy period into the growth period. And so typically, depending a little bit on the weather, on the temperatures, I will be providing the first watering, no nutrients, just some watering, some light watering, maybe end March, and then again maybe early April. So once, twice, maybe 3 times that I provide some watering to my cacti without any nutrients. And that really is to slowly stimulate them to get back into growth mode, for them to redevelop their root networks. And when all that is in place, then only should I be thinking of giving the first fertilizer doses, if you like, to my plants. Just recently I posted a video on my channel that deals with how I go about with the watering of my cacti and other succulents. And so I won't be repeating all of that. Please go and check out that video if you're interested, and just take a look at how I go about watering my plants. So typically then, round about late April, early May, my plants will now be well and truly back into growth mode. That's actually when I add the fertilizer that I use in the correct doses as prescribed. That's when I add that fertilizer to my water. And so you might remember I have these large water tanks. What I actually do is I use a smaller tank that I put the pumps into, and then that's where I have the fertilizer added in the correct ratio to the water, and that's the water that I use to then water my cacti with the fertilizer added. About 4, perhaps 6 weeks after that first fertilizer dose, I'm now probably around June. That's when I once again add the fertilizer to the normal watering procedure. And typically I also fertilize a 3rd time in each growing season, and that's as we sort of tail off, come to the end of the growing period. And so typically round about August, so maybe 4, maximum 6 weeks before stopping the growth phase, and when the cacti then are moved into their dormancy phase. So round about 4 weeks prior to that is the last time that I add the fertilizer to the watering procedure. And so that gives me 3 fertilizer events, if you like, 3 feedings with nutrients per season. What's important to remember is that none of this is cast in stone, and everyone will have their own process, procedure, and also program and frequency, if you like. And so what I've been describing really is the way that I go about fertilizing, typically 3 times a growth season. I know of other growers who actually fertilize only twice, at the beginning and at the end, but I also know of other growers who actually fertilize every 2 or 3 weeks. So that's really up to you. But remember, it's a bit like with the watering. With cacti, you probably don't want to overfeed them in the same way as you don't want to overwater them. So I would actually, if you like, err on the low side rather than the high side. You might think, okay, well, my cacti will actually grow faster, they'll get a lot bigger if I fertilize them a lot. Maybe, and if you're lucky, you know, they will actually do that. But there's also, as I said, that risk that you're actually overfeeding the cacti, that in fact they get bloated. I've seen a lot of cacti, because they're getting a lot of nutrients, too much nutrients, that they actually tear open on the sides, and that you know, they get these open wounds, if you like, which are then of course an ideal entry area for pests, for fungi, and that very quickly can lead to the rotting of the plant, of the roots, of the plant stem itself. Okay, so enough of N, P, and K. I hope I haven't confused you completely now. But I do think it is actually important, and it is worth you knowing what is in your fertilizer, in the food that you're actually feeding your plants. Okay, I hope I've been able to give you a little bit of information and some insights into this topic of fertilizing and nutrients for cacti, and I hope that you found this information useful. If you did, and if you like these type of videos, there's obviously quite a few more on other topics on my channel, and it would be fantastic if you actually gave me a like or you left a comment. And if you haven't yet subscribed, obviously it'd be fantastic if you subscribed to my channel. It's a great way of supporting small channels like mine, and I'd be really delighted to have you back as a regular visitor to this channel. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks very much for dropping in today, and I hope to see you very soon again. Until then, take care, stay safe, and as always, happy growing.